I suppose this is what my talk's about. Who is an art critic and what is their labor? I mean, the journalism's all about the who, why, where, what, and all that. So, who is an art critic is pretty a standard question. Who do you read? Who do you read? I mean, that's your, who's your favorite art critic? Yeah, come. I mean, I think the problem with the question, it immediately poses one of like, oh God, it's terribly highbrow. So how many of you are on social media? How many of you follow at least one, maybe, art critic? Yeah, I mean, look at Jerry Saltz's weird Instagram. I mean, he's an art critic. Who else? We don't want to talk about Jerry or Jerry Gargosian, so name someone else.
Instagram-wise, there was once something called the White Pew.
Yeah, those two women, right? Yeah, they sort of shut up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's one called Reopen, just started an Instagram. And he also paints live and talks about it, but also looks at other people's stuff.
That's the beauty of Instagram. You could be famous in a week and art history after 2 weeks. I mean, there's such the time in there. I suppose in shifting that question to where is an art critic to social media, you'll pick up as I show how things operate. But who is an art critic? I don't know if you recognize this gentleman. Sol Plaatje, one of the founders of the African National Congress, but far more important in other ways for his writings. Walter Battus. You all know him as an artist. He's one of our country's, I would say, important art critics. James Baldwin. You know who James Baldwin is. You know who Richard Avedon is, I hope. Interestingly, if you read about James Baldwin, he talks about his first model of being an artist, of being in the culture of arts and letters, was a painter, Buford Delaney. Writers and artists are very interested in each other. It's not always antagonistic. Do you know this person? So do you want to grab a seat where you can actually spectate? You can see, okay. Just keep her name in mind, Tracy Rose. So this is just a little summary of why I showed those people. The South African art critic has had to have a very fluid and mobile identity. It's partly because we operate in a strange between space as a media culture. We're not New York, but we have a history. And that's partly what my talk's about. If you're interested in writing, if you're interested in argument, who are you arguing against? What tradition? If you say you have no tradition, what do you mean by we have no tradition? And so, yeah, I'm going to sketch very briefly. I mean, I want to start not with the tradition of white newspapers, historically white. Just look at the beginnings of a cosmopolitan conversation, because that's all you're participating in. When you're writing about art, you're participating in a conversation that is highly cosmopolitan and metropolitan. Newspapers are an expression of that. Yes, they're dying in the present tense, but we'll get to that later. There's Sol Plaatje, a man I admire. Wrote Setswana proverbs, wrote Native Life in South Africa. It's probably the first book of investigative journalism in this country. It's far more than that. There's his antagonist, John Jabavu, who sort of represented the Eastern Cape morality. Interestingly enough, I think there was a young Michaelis student who eventually went and was the editor of the paper in recent years. But let's look, we're all in Cape Town, Cape Times. This is an 1876 edition. So already by the start of more than 100 years ago, if you were an artist practicing in this town, you could anticipate, not have as of right, but you could anticipate commentary. And it would typically appear in a newspaper, because that was the apex of information. There wasn't some kind of higher knowledge or higher thing. I mean, it's very different now. Newspapers have been superseded by this kind of the cloud and everything that exists in it. This is where this idea of the art critic and the artist being involved in producing texts about culture. Sort of, here's an example. This is Die Brandwacht. It has a problematic history, but it was more, I think, when it was revived and called Die Nieuwe Brandwacht. But in its original conception, it was a sort of salon magazines for bougie people. So all of you would have, I guess, clearly read like House and Leisure, etc., that kind of thing. Maybe I suppose the model of this was You magazine in its earlier form. So you could see a bit of everything, and it would include art. But interestingly, all the covers were designed by Pierneef and Frans Oudde. And they were highly involved in the production of the publication. That's a young Pierneef before he became a kind of nationalist icon. And you can sort of see the type of culture that they were sharing in there. Maybe more interesting is the cover designs and always the content. So let's get to 48. I'm going quickly. I don't want to sort of labor on things. Lantern's a very important magazine if you're looking at like the history of South African art writing. Starts in 1951, ends in the late 90s. Contributors I'll mention in a moment, but Walter Battis writes in issue 2, 3, and 4. And at that time, he's a young man. He's not very well known. He's not King Third III of Fook Island. He's a kind of pensive guy who, on time off from teaching, would often go to rural areas and document rock paintings and petroglyphs, which are distinct. Those are the engravings in rocks. And that's what he was famous for, nearly until his 50s. So in this publication, he writes about South Africa's first art. And his observations are very acute. I mean, he came from a sort of working class background. So unlike, say, Irma Stern and a number of other figures in our history, didn't travel abroad to get trained. He went into the veld, so to speak, and saw what the first South Africans produced. Here's a much later, this is from, I think, the late 60s. It's an article on op art, and it is written by none other than Cecily Sash, who's part of the Amadlozi, with Cecil Scottness and Sidney Khumalo and Ezrum Lechai. Very influential teacher at Wits, who left. She was an out lesbian, didn't like the cultural and racial politics of South Africa and moved to the UK. Died, I think, at age 100, about 2 or 3 years ago. So you can, the idea of the magazine as a salon and a conversation and showing what's hip and trendy. Long history, that's what they do. It's not always for like heavy discourse. It's just kind of giving you a summary. Victor Vasarely on the right, the early Goodman Gallery, might now be famous for only sort of selling African or diasporic artists. That time they imported Victor Vasarely and sold tons of them. So this is the kind of what you would be rubbing up against, like in a newspaper. Corruption art in Lantern, contact lenses, and rock art, or up art. Mm-hmm. Look at who some of the contributors were. I mean, amongst the artists were Christo Coetzee, Khumalo, Lechai. More interestingly, Stephen Sack wrote, and a very young graduate of economics at UCT called Michael Stevenson wrote an article about investable art in 1989. And he said, invest in Irma Stern, Pierneef, I mean, basically a Strauss & Co. catalog. Writing, I suppose why I point this out, it's not to indict Michael. Writing serves various purposes. Writing about art serves various purposes. Michael's doctorate, I mean, because he entered UCT and did actuarial science up to master's level and was teaching economics, and then went and interned for the art dealer Louis Schachert, and then pivoted and He did his PhD on how the landlords used art to buy cultural prestige in the UK. So what was he doing? He was understanding the mind of the collector, using writing, and he became a dealer, a very accomplished dealer. It's not the only route. Anyway, we're still in the apartheid period. If you read the Strauss & Co. or the Aspire catalogs, much of the commentary and the kind of validation for why certain works are important go back to statements in Lantern or to this publication, which sort of grouped all the articles that appeared in Lantern. There's a troubling side to Lantern because it was a state-funded publication. So it tended to, all its messaging happened within a certain kind of, let's say, bracket. If it fell outside of that, you wouldn't read about it. There's nothing in any of the Lanterns about Wopko Jensme or Lucas Siache. Part of that thing is if you have an official culture and a very strong proposition of what nationhood is, it breeds a reaction, which is summarized in 2 words. Fuck you! So people start their own publications. I mean, it's totally what you see happening online. And these are like proto-blogs, proto sort of web newsletters. It's a bunch of enthusiasts getting together and doing something. So these fears, like an example, comes from, I mean, there's a number. There's like Virum, Izwi, a whole bunch of publications that were either strictly literary with some art interest or a kind of hybrid. So Izwi and Virum were like sort of progressive poetry journals where they would collaborate with artists and have graphics in each issue so that they would become collectible. The covers were handmade. So I think there's an example here. No, wait, I'll show it to you now. So I suppose in American terms, those type of publications are called little magazines. And it's something that Nadine Gordimer very affectionately wrote about, saying that's where she kind of grew up as a writer. And all of this is dusty history. You know, I can see your tensions. Oh, this is kind of curious, but what's it relevant? You'll see how history has a way of repeating itself. The Classic, very important magazine in terms of South African literary journalism, as opposed to merely newspaper journalism. And people that wrote for it would be like Bessie Head, Nat Nakasa, and you pick up these little fragments where people are arguing about our history, why certain painters are better than other painters. Some of these publications are incredibly hard to find. Others are click away on Bob Shop. So here's an incredibly short-lived magazine, and this is the story of South African enthusiasm for self-publishing. Let's do something, and then it lasts all of a month, 6 months, a year, and it's like call quits. Fontaine is an example of that. This is the first issue, Fountain, for those of you who can't speak Afrikaans, published in 1960. One of the names here is very important, Charles Eglinton, poet. He translated a couple of Afrikaans novels into English. After working in the avant-garde pits of Fontaine, he was like, I need money, which is the usual crisis for all writers. And he went and became editor of Optima magazine, which was the publication, or is still the publication of Anglo-American. And Charles Eglinton commissioned all of David Goldblatt's early photo essays. So On the Mines, David Goldblatt's first book, comes out of being published in Optima by Charles Eglinton. In Boxburg, same setup. So there's these sort of like invisible histories that you can track through these publications. First issue, you can see the contents. Wanted, a history of art in South Africa, written by Walter Battis, prints at the Joburg Art Gallery. Art and Architecture by Norman Eaton, who built the house that Alexis Preller lived in, etc., etc. These kind of ideas of what is our history. they become serial occupations. You even see it in, I think, online to a degree. Anyway, that's the second issue, and then it was never heard of again. So this would be, I suppose, the first commercial publication devoted to art in South Africa. And it existed and lived and died by that terrible model of advertising, which can only take you so far. They're very weird magazines when you look at them, because they look like sort of those bumper issues of Vogue. It's like, there's no content, it's just a bunch of adverts. Like the one on the right, the Goodman Gallery. Very much a portrait from the 60s. Those are all Linda Givon's earliest artists. I think Linda is in here somewhere. I mean, when you look at the names, most of them are absolutely forgotten. Winston Sauli was the second black artist collected in the Joburg Art Gallery, for those of you who don't know, after Gerard Sokoto. Again, Walter Battis, those fingers of his. So De Arte, it's a journal of UNISA, still exists and started in '65. Walter Battis was the founding editor, because after being a schoolmaster, he became a lecturer at the University of South Africa and later professor. Here's a very interesting interview from, I think it's the 80s, by Ivor Powell, who's an art critic. At that point was a lecturer at UNISA, and he interviewed his former teacher, Robert Hodgins, at Wits. It appears in there. Robert was a teacher, but before that, for a period, 62 to 68, he was a full-time art critic. And he told me once, you know what, my boy, I wrote far better than Esme Berman. He took over her job from... Much of that writing is unrecorded, in that no one really knows about it. I went and dug up some of it, and it was really fascinating. For instance, he thought, for those of you from Joburg, you'll totally get this, that Christo Coetzee was a cheap joke that would play well in Alberton. And he highly admired Alexis Preller, which I would not have thought. And he also wrote very beautifully about Eduardo Villa. I mean, we forget that these people that are now dead and part of history were once young and ambitious and trying to hustle their way ahead. And those are the kind of conversations that you encounter. Here's a contents page from a 2002 edition. Whose name do we see there again? Mike Stevenson, reviewing Marion Arnold's books on South African botanical art. A year later, Michael Stevenson opens Michael Stevenson Contemporary. In 2000, I think it was 6 or 7, he went to the Venice Biennale, and Tino Segal had a performance where people were dancing in a room. Oh, this is contemporary. So shortly afterwards, it was Michael Stevenson. And then not long after, it just became Stevenson. I'm not ragging Michael. I'm a great fan of him. A kind of strange magazine, Art, Design, and Architecture. An American artist found these in a junk shop in Cork Bay, a whole pile of them. And he sort of presented and it's like, what is this? And it's like, well, it's Art, Design, and Architecture. I can't answer more than that. This is the launch issue. It's Manfred Ziller on the cover. Came out in the 80s and sort of wandered into the early 90s. Luxury format, so like an A5 color. And it tried to sort of capture look at the zeitgeist. The Salon magazine, Hilton Wiener, was basically like our knockoff version of Giorgio Armani. Some of you might disagree. David Brown, Pippa Scottness's partner, he would hate that. David Brown, the sculptor, neglected tradition, Stephen Sachs, very important exhibition, etc., etc. Afropex, if you're interested in South African photography. So, when you open the books of the past, they reflect awkwardly on the present. Zulethu Mthethwa is currently serving a very long prison sentence for murder. There's also very beautiful writing in there. I'm a great fan of David Goldblatt, and it's intriguing to see people writing about him. And the poet Stephen Watson in 1990 wrote, I think, a very extraordinary appreciation of David that's worth digging up. What's sad is often how these early appreciations of artists' career get lost. And then there's these authorizing voices who wander in and say things. And it's often at this sort of earlier phase that you get far more interesting writing. I mean, you know who that artist is, Norman Catherine. I think that was the last issue. They tried to sort of have city-themed issues, and then it just kind of ran its course and coughed, sneezed, sighed, and just stopped. Like Verwoerd's sculpture, which just ended up at the back of Voortrekker Monument, where I found it. But my title was An Unkillable Rabbit Family of Enthusiasm and Optimism. Yes, the publications died. We still believe in writing. We still believe in art. And that's the sort of contradiction. So I have a pal. By this time, he's left UNISA, and he started writing for the Weekly Mail, which is now the Mail and Guardian, and becomes their art critic. He's a pal of Jane Alexander, etc., etc. And he starts this magazine. So it was the moment of optimism post-1994. So this, the AVA Gallery, which you all know, is part of like a national association. So they're like, we need to do things differently. And how do you do things differently? You make a magazine. So they made Art Ventilator. It's designed by Roy Klukas, who at that point was, I suppose, one of South Africa's best graphic designers. So this is issue number 1. So it's also issue last, first and last. That's when I asked Ivor about it one day. What is this thing? It was always, and from the start, a cowboy enterprise. He wrote, this is in his editorial. This is 95. Our society is shadowed at every point by gloomy authoritarianism. It is wildly skewed with iniquity and disadvantage. Our collective mindset is fearful, antagonistic, parochial. I mean, we are in the 30th year of reassessing. How far have we moved away from that? Are we still fearful, antagonistic, parochial? Contents, Brett Murray. There's also an article by Kendall Gears. There's an interview with Robert Hodgins. So, Ventilator starts because of the energy and momentum of the first Joburg Biennale. Nkgopoleng will probably talk a bit more, I'm not sure, about Artrab, which she currently edits. Started in 97, partly to kind of harness the enthusiasm of the second Joburg Biennale. This is the very slick, almost present design. It's not exactly, I think it has been redesigned, but in its early years, they still had macromedia plugins. So if you were sitting in an office and you logged into Artrab, it would have this ping. Ping! It was awful. It's like, just shut it down. It's like when you leave the sound on Instagram and you're in a public space. Caught. I won't talk too much, but that's Sue, for those of you who don't know. Yeah. So it was initially a kind of mixture between a diary and a blog, and it evolved. Sue was also, and still is, because she nags me now and again, have you received your New Yorkers? And then she'll borrow some. And if you know the New Yorker format, the front section has city listings, and they have the tiny little things called capsule reviews. And I suppose if you're not in the industry, they just, okay, you read a little bit about a show, you tick it off, you might go. But the behind-the-scenes fighting to even get a review is like a major deal. And there's also like a real art to writing 50 words that says everything about a show. And Sue tried to transpose that to Artrab. It dismally failed. This is what I like about the internet versus print. It has a kind of live or perpetual memory. I think it's slightly harder to find now, but if you find Candice Brights's art bio, It's definitely not the reworked version. This is Candice, probably in her late 20s. And this is also what you can sort of find when you go dig. I know she, for many years, harassed Sue. Please take my art bio down. It's too revealing. I don't want those projects shown. So Artthrob starts in 97. I mean, it seizes the enthusiasm and the possibility of Web 1.0. So in a sense, this publication is ridiculous because it's 2002 and you start a print magazine. Why? Bear in mind, it's pre-smartphone. So the idea of the internet was still, oh, I'm going to log on my terminal, and then you get connected and waiting for images to download. So that might partly explain a quarterly. So I edited Artthrob, and I was, let's say, poached to when Sophie Perrier, who works at Stevenson Gallery now, she was the launch editor. And when she'd had enough of the publisher, which, as some of you know, is kind of easy, she moved off and then gave me the poison chalice, which was a lot of fun. Just to acknowledge other contemporaries, because when I once gave a version of this, I didn't show our times, and the editor and publisher fumed and stormed out the room, which was kind of laughable, but hey. This thing's a rag. If he was here, I would tell it to his face. They sell double-page adverts to artists you've never heard of, and the content is all solicited from advertisers. If you are getting advertising paid, do some work. Yeah. That is the basic courtesy. This thing's a cut and paste rag. You can quote me. You can see I'm defending a certain position. So I took over Art South Africa in 2004, and it had a monthly cycle. I got 10,000 Rand per month, so it was 30,000 per issue. I was living in Joburg. It didn't include per diem. It didn't include tickets to come down to Cape Town to work on the issue. It didn't include place to stay, so I would hustle, and do this to eventually getting it, all right, if we can finish it in a week, then it's not eating into my other time because I did newspaper work to live. You know, so you're kind of balancing a mixture of belief that this project has integrity with, as Nkgopoleng will probably tell you, where the money? Yeah. So, yeah, I fell into that trap that we all do. What is our history? And this issue was partly looked at what I suppose this talk is about. You know, I'm interested in where we come from, because I think if you want to reject a certain way of writing or thinking or history, you at least have to know the history. It's all fair and well to say that I'm new and different, but what are you different to? How are you the same or different? Interestingly, having seen those 60s magazines, and my first ever piece of published writing was, I'm embarrassed to say, a poem in Staff Rider. So I believe in different modes of writing, and also that these publications shouldn't become specialist ghettos. So I commissioned in this issue Ivan Vladislavich to write a short story, and I just said, just send me a new short story, and his was about Pieniov. Subsequently got anthologized, and artists borrowed it for their exhibitions without ever acknowledging my brilliance. Which partly leads to this man. Transition is a very important little magazine or journal. It's a literary publication that was started in Uganda in the 60s. Many of you might know Louis Theroux, the funny TV guy. So Louis's dad, Paul Theroux, the very famous sort of travel writer. Paul Theroux was part of the American Corps at that time, living in Uganda, and contributed to very early issues of Transition. When things kind of blew up in Uganda, it moved to Nigeria, where Wole Soyinka, the very famous playwright, took over. And then if you listen to the debates, it's like, who's paying for this thing? Man, this thing's just like a proxy for Western culture. So Wole Soyinka made a gamble. He said they're not going to take foreign funding. And what happened? It tanked in a year because we all believe in culture. Try sell that enthusiasm to the public. It tanked and then it was revived. So Transition now exists, but it's a scholarly journal of Duke University, meaning it's a zombie. That still publishes very luminous writing, but it doesn't represent what it did in the 60s, which was like a kind of post-colonial moment, trying to figure out a language and an attitude. So this is the founding editor. And I love the statement, an editor should be neutral, not a neuter. So you should be capable of holding contradictions when you produce a publication. Which partly prompts a little bit this issue. There was all that anxiety about Jacob Zuma becoming president following the kind of putsch in Polokwane. And I was like, well, artists can comment on this. And so we did a special issue, commissioned this graphic, taking the song for a walk, Bring Me My Machine Gun, which was causing so much anxiety at the time, and got different people to comment on it. Got Ivor Powell to write a piece, Michael McGarry, who's currently showing at Everard Reed, we used one of his graphics, and I asked Lesego Rampolokeng, the poet, to write a poem. It was interesting doing that because you have the ambition and then he sends you the poem and it's like, I'm not a poetry editor, so I can't really assess if it's good or bad. So you just go on that terrible thing called feeling. I feel the vibe, it's fine, we're going to publish it. Brett Murray. Look what he's enacting there. So in my last year, I got some columnists. So I got Esme Berman to write. Very important figure historically. I approached Tracy Rose and I said, you have 750 words, write what you wish. So she gave me that in 750 words. I thought it was joyous. We paid her. The publisher was not so happy. That publication has morphed into Art Africa. It recognized something in Art Times model where you do essentially like media partnerships. So you go to, let's say there's a biennale in Doha and you say, we'll interview the curator and we'll feature an arts profile. We give you 12 pages. The media value of this is that. Fly us there and put us up at a 5-star hotel. It's done them well. Is it art criticism? Not a fucking chance. This is a key event. And I think it will be retold and rethought in many ways. So I'm not going to say what I think of it, because I think people have different understandings of it. But it does mark a shift in the cultural temperature and sense of who's speaking about who and what's being said. If you take what Tracy Rose is sort of speaking back to the sort of dominant language in the art publications, man, this is just white paint, just the whole time. And that's what that moment possibly represented. But, Chimurenga was started in 2002. There's an early edition of Chimurenga. It's more conventionally, although Ntone would kill me, Ntone Jabe, the publisher and editor, a literary magazine. So it was a literary magazine is a literary magazine interested in art. And there's a slight difference between art magazines because they tend to speak in a different way. So if you open, I think, this particular issue, you'll find an extraordinary piece of writing by Ashraf Jamal on Zwelethwa Mthethwa. Does the fact that it's Zwelethwa invalidate it? Does it make the writing less extraordinary? Go find it. You judge. If you go to the Venice Biennale in the present tense, John Akamfra is in the English pavilion or the British pavilion. if you want to know and get a kind of more intriguing insight, don't read the press or what's online. Go find publications like this. If you went to Africa Remix, you'd probably recognize this artist. I'm not going to go too deeply into this. This is Jean-Pierre Beccolo. He made the first independent film in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a vampire movie in the kind of style of Tarantino. It's both rubbish and great. We all know that feeling. It's like, okay, this is so just, but it's great. I think the idea of the literary magazine is also endangered, but not. When you go online, there's so many literary publications that are pure online entities, and they're native there. This comes from that, I suppose, transitionary period. The Facebook and the whole social media thing hasn't fully come and like strip mined everything. But at the same time, a little petite highbrow magazine is like, who are we speaking to? You know, who's reaching it? So Chimurenga, because people like them, got a lot of foreign money. Never mind Wallace Yinka and that gamble. It's like, Goethe Institute, give us money. And so they produced this hugely ambitious one-off newspaper. And the conceit or the editorial brief was, this newspaper, published in 2011, comes out on the day of all that xenophobic violence that broke out in April 2008, most famously with that man that was burnt alive. I contributed to it. It was, yeah, I think it was a provocative and conceptual challenge, and it was met as such. I mean, this thing is still being produced by Antone, and they do it as a kind of project for specific events. So they might go, if I use the Doha example again, they'll go do a Chimurenga edition that looks at the Middle East. I think I've got a slide of it. Yeah, there's one at the Sharjah Biennale. I think it's fantastic. Just to say, it's a great idea, but it wasn't original. This literary journal, McSweeney's, produced a newspaper in 2009. It was based on the kind of English tradition of the Sunday newspaper, where you get alles except MTN advertising. Very sort of fun and reimaginative thinking of the newspaper, because partly their argument was that tradition of the newspaper was dying, and we need to somehow both commemorate it, but also revive its possibility. I showed that. So this we're sort of tipping into the present tense. The reason, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen this publication. Came out 2012, contributors. Kenji Nkosi, you would know. Kemang doesn't need introduction. Ra Klasane, teaches at Wits. I mean, look how modest it is. It looks like those Iswis from the 60s, stapled. Because typically it's like, how much budget we got? What is the wizard's quote? And it's like that kind of balance. The reason that, take one name there, CUS. How many of you know CUS Group? You know CUS Group.
I don't think so. Isn't it?
Jamal. We'll get there. Bukhosi.
Of course.
His first name's not familiar. Don't worry, we'll get there. So look at just the handmade quality, this paperness. I mean, unfortunately, the cult of paper has become like a bit artisanal. It's like people who have fancy moustaches and drink flat whites. But there's a different history that it sort of channels, if you think of it, going back to Botswana in the 1980s, Medu Art Ensemble, so people like Tami Minyele. And these presses made posters that were smuggled in South Africa. Again, bear in mind that's pre-internet. So the press as an object was much like, I suppose, the computers or the data centers that enable cloud computing. If you want to essentially do away with what you deem dangerous, what do? You switch off the electricity. The SADF raided Botswana and blew up the presses. And there was famously a photograph of them standing next to a press saying it's a terrorist device. It's like, but you could see the traditions that, are sort of arguing against each other and are also complementary. Here's a total jump from what is essentially a political underground to Cape Town circa the 10s, sort of pre and post the Fallist period. How many of you know Lake? There's a couple of you. Yeah, you would have seen it around. It was a freebie, and they would have very jazzy, funky covers, I think. They I think, leaned more into the pop than the art. Yeah. And that was what was fun about it. Well, yeah, it is past tense. Steph Naudé, who was the founder and publisher, painter, very like pop, very sort of post the whole street art thing. So that was his inspiration. And his first publications he worked on was Sessions, which was a skateboard magazine. And there's a whole tradition of like DIY, skate and surf magazines that he sort of brought in to this publication. I thought the covers were fantastic. You know, it's the first place where you would have actually seen Lady Scully acknowledged in a way that doesn't feel in passing. I mean, she's on the cover. She went to, when did she win the Standard Bank? It was about a year ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah. So this is from, it's issue 5, so it's like 2015, 16. Tony Gum. This is what I liked. Who reads these things? I liked that he wasn't really sure. He just said people who have a similar mindset and they're basically mid-20s to late 40s. I guess if you had to go into a very formal boardroom and try pitch that, they would like, what is your LSM? That's like, what is that? So if the lake was very pop, adjective, which isn't present, it's actually died in 2019, was one of those like ventilator. Rah, we're coming out strong. No, wait, I think I cut it out. And a lot of ambition, blah, blah, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It lasted all of 3 print issues, and the online just sort of like teetered and then just... but if you understand that that's the history of the publications and the enthusiasm, so it's more important who was involved in those projects. You know, so if you look at this, Kanya works at A4 Arts Foundation, has gotten a career as a curator and a writer. You could see Tuli Gametse, who writes frequently for Artrab. She teaches at Wits, right?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Yeah, but
okay.
she did, yeah.
This is just the context. This piece by Jill Lepore in New Yorker, it's really fascinating. You should dig it up. It's about the history of Time magazine and New Yorker. It's just a story of the history of the two, the two magazines. Time magazine, the model is everything that you need to know is stated in very plain language in 400 words. New Yorker's like, I need a thesaurus for this 5,000 word profile of like a very like lame actress. Because that's how they write. It's like very highbrow. But the history of the New Yorker, ironically, was it's trying to be important. The publisher didn't come from wealthy circumstances, so he wanted to announce himself in high society. Time magazine was started by an incredibly wealthy person. And I want to speak to the common man. You can see these, but it's this, anyway, listen to me. This comment is so true of magazines globally. If the magazines are starting and dying in these projects, it's true everywhere. Magazines are ephemeral. I like her thing there. They evanesce. And one magazine displaces the next. They molt. They lose their skin. They're rarely long-lived. But as Nadine Gordimer said, they're an unkillable rabbit family of optimism and enthusiasm. There's adjective again. I'm not going to go too long. I brought the tone down because it was hip and young. I pitched an article about Walter Battus. can see where my allegiances lie. It was fun to write it though. The opening was all about people sticking it to Walter Battis. Not going to go very long. Bubblegum Club. I suppose if you're wanting to, Bubblegum Club's basically picked up arguably where Lake has left off. So it's started by Jamal Kubeka, who was part of the CUS Group. CUS Group were on the Berlin Biennale in 2015. There were a couple of other projects. They were very involved in what was essentially like this internet art moment in the past decade. And you have Bukhosi Sekukuni, who has subsequently moved to Oregon. You have Tabita Rezare, who came here and I think got involved with Nolan Oswald Dennis. It's a very particular like little clique. And she subsequently moved to Guyana and started a yoga studio. But this is sort of what's going on in the background here. These are people that are artists that think, man, we need this stuff intelligently written about. We don't want to hear Sean O'Toole in the Mail and Guardian, that dude likes Walter Battis. It's like from the other century. And that's, I think, totally important and totally valid. I'll just end on this. This was, I think my interest in the past is really to understand where I'm going. I'm not a historian. Interestingly enough, Chimurenga did the same project on a far more ambitious way. They got funding and they mapped all these publications, independent publications across Africa, and some in the diaspora. So there's like Revue Noire, the Paris art magazine about African art. Simon Njami comes out of there, Ngone Fall. You would read about Staff Rider. There's so many publications here. There's this one, Hey Futzak, which if you are of a certain age, you would remember the publisher walking around town selling his photocopied publication. And people were like, yo, no, that guy's scary. But they've become hugely collectible and sort of reflective of a particular moment. Anyway, this little statement I think's so true. I don't think as writers you are historians. What you are doing is sort of when you decide to write about art and put it out in the public, you're affirming memory. This is worth remembering. You're not trying to write some official historical narrative. You're just saying, look at this. I saw it. It's interesting. It's worth being translated into words and somehow being remembered. Thank you.